Hello, everyone. It is 12 o'clock Central, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I know some people are still loading on, but I'm Misty Hicks. I am the co-founder of Wonders and Worries and the director of the Registered Wonders and Worries Provider Program and the host of these WonderChats. And we certainly missed y'all in December. Hopefully you had some time to sort of slow down a little bit, spend time with family. I am certain we are all looking forward to a brighter 2021, but we are glad to be back with you. So before we get started on our topic today, which is professional boundaries in uncharted territories, which I feel we all think is super important. And no matter how many times we have talked about boundaries and ethics, it's one of those things that you have to keep continuing to talk about and think about, hear different perspectives. So I'm so grateful today that Meredith and Crystal will be able to sort of give you another lens or another frame to think about. Housekeeping though, you know what we do, it's typical. If you've been on one of our chats before, your video and your audio is already muted, so don't worry. We don't use the chat feature, but we do use the question and answer feature. So if you see the Q&A button on your screen and you have a question, go ahead and put it in there right away. And I'll be watching that and moderating that. Sometimes I might throw it in right away for our presenters to answer. Sometimes I might hold it, but go ahead and type it in there when you have it so I'll know. The recording of this webinar, and then I know there's an article at least that we'll be uploading as well, will be on our website. And I'll keep an eye on the technology issues as we go through. Hopefully we won't have any, but just in case, don't worry, I'm on it. Crystal, you want to hit the next one? As far as evaluations, of course, I know you've probably heard me say this a ton of times, but we look at those and we really think about what you've said. We look to change things. We look to add things. We look for suggestions about topics as we're planning out our year. So really appreciate the evaluative feedback that you give us at the end. When the session is over and you go to log out, the survey will pop up automatically. So certainly we would appreciate that feedback. If you forget or you don't have time when it pops up automatically, you'll receive an email automatically tomorrow with a link to the survey. So lots of opportunities to provide that feedback. As far as the PDU process, I know some of you all might be listening just for personal growth and development. Absolutely awesome to do that. If you are interested in PDUs, we offer those via our store. So we have a post-assessment now attached to each of our WonderChats. You will go ahead and purchase for a nominal fee. This one would be $15 because it's $10 per PDU hour, and this is a 1.5 session. You can purchase the post-assessment. When you successfully complete that, you're automatically sent your PDU certificate. And now, I'm excited. I know that if you've been on our WonderChats before, you likely have met my friends and colleagues that are on here today. Meredith Cooper is the other co-founder and my dear friend and colleague who co-founded Wonders and Worries. And then Crystal Wilkins, who is our Director of Programming for Operations at Wonders and Worries. I could listen to these ladies all day. So anyway, I'm excited to have them here to share some thoughts about boundaries and ethics. And I know in some of our other WonderChats, we've covered it kind of here and there. There's been a couple along the way where we've touched on pieces, but I'm excited and grateful that they're going to be able to kind of do a deeper dive on that today. So I'm going to turn that over to Crystal and Meredith.
Oh. Well, thank you. Crystal and I are so honored to be able to be with you today. And as Missy said, we're thinking that this is going to be hopefully a dialogue to stimulate thought. It's not a presentation with right or wrong answers, especially when speaking about ethics and boundaries in uncharted areas. It's never a right or wrong answer, it feels like, at least to us. And what may be right for one person in a given situation may look different for another person, both either at that point in their life or in a different situation. So our presentation today is more of a dialogue, and I hope that you feel free to share your thoughts with us as we go forward. The other thing I wanted to make sure that you are aware of is that my perspective is largely going to be from a community-based setting. I think most of you are familiar with Wonders and Worries, but let me just share a little bit about that, and then also point out to you that Crystal is our program director in charge of operations. So her heart beats a little closer to the traditional child life specialists who sometimes come to work for Wonders and Worries, because her onboarding of those child life specialists gives her just that little perspective of what it can be like, more than me perhaps, to be moving from a traditional to a non-traditional setting. But in addition to that, she has vast experience in the traditional setting and has her own private practice. So we're hoping that with all these different lenses, we can share our experiences today. Just backing up for a moment, in case some of you are not as familiar with Wonders and Worries, Missy and I were both working 20 years ago, almost, in pediatric oncology child life settings. Missy was in Atlanta, I was here in Austin, but we both came to the awareness that children have the same need for child life skills when it is their parent with a serious illness. Missy came to Austin, as I said, and we put our heads together and our hearts together to realize that we had both the skill set to meet those needs and the passion to do so. One of the things I want to be sure and mention to you is that in that very beginning, especially in today's age when I think so many of us can be a little challenged or frustrated around where our professional roles are going, we had in our own personal lives the opportunities to try this new adventure because we had resources within our families to allow us to take a big step forward in starting Wonders and Worries. And I'm also going to say that technically today in this presentation, Crystal is going to be running the slides, so you're going to hear me say next every once in a while. So Crystal, if you'll go to the next slide, please. Another foundation for this presentation is to point out to you that were certain pillars of ethical practice that we felt we needed to put around our organization. And we had the distinction of wanting to provide best clinical practice while also wanting to have best business practices. We were in the midst of trying to deliver child life services while running a business that needed to basically do outreach. We had to let people know what we were doing in the community. And again, I think being a little bit naive in the beginning, I sort of felt like in Field of Dreams, you know, if you build it, they will come. And we've certainly learned over time that that's not the case. You need a lot of skills around marketing to do that. So here we were trying to figure out skills, funding to run a business, as well as delivering that best clinical practice. And when we started out, we were fortunate that, of course, we have our ethical guidelines of our child life practice, which was a wonderful reference for us. There were times, especially so many years ago, when not every wondering that we had was addressed by the Child Life Council. So we often turn to the American Counseling Association for a second look at what best practices might be. And I would share with you that I think we all experienced that a little bit this past in spring of 20. I know we turned to our colleagues, and so that's part of the consultation piece of it, of trying to, as we were thinking about shifting from in-person to virtual services, what were some of those best practices that we could look at and gain consultation from colleagues of ours that maybe were marriage and family therapists or others. The consultation has been an integral part of establishing Wonders and Worries, both from a clinical perspective, sometimes in a community delivering services sort of in a silo. We didn't have the resources that you might have in a traditional hospital for others to check in around, is this client exhibiting just challenges around the adjustment of a parent with a serious illness, or does he have more profound depression that needs to be addressed perhaps by someone that has more skills than us as a child life specialist? So we began and continue to rely on professional consultation in the community around clinical services, but also around best business practices. Well, Missy and I certainly had some experiences through volunteer roles and other things in the community, to be able to understand, when do you do an audit? When is that required? At what budget level? Or how many years of existence is it best practice to invest in an audit? So we are constantly looking at other people in the community, and we were very fortunate in Austin because both another nonprofit dedicated to providing information to nonprofits existed, and early on in our relationship, potentially foreseeing that Missy might relocate, she took the director of programming role and I took the executive director role. So there were several years that I invested my time in those courses around how do you do a nomination process for a board member. Again, what are ethical guidelines for running a raffle for a gala? So we were utilizing consultation in the community for both clinical practice and running the business. In addition, we were relying on supervision as we grew as a child life team, making sure that we built within our organization time for that one-on-one supervision with the director of programming around clients, but then also having built into our programming time, or our staff time, program staff meetings where as a group we could share maybe challenges, things that were going well, and provide information. And then in addition to that supervision, and today we'll talk a little bit more about what that kind of structure looks like, but we have added, and we mentioned it other times, supervision for our program directors and myself outside of the organization, so that each level has supervision, giving them oversight. And finally, we added evidence-based practice. From the very beginning, we wanted to be ensuring that we were evaluating our services, making sure that what we thought we were delivering is being delivered and perceived in that form from our client families, and that we built on those evaluations to ensure that we also were participating in research to allow best practices to be going forward, as well as providing time for our staff to be exploring best practices in other areas from other people, so that we were staying on top of what the most recent research was. So those are some of the pillars that Wonders and Worries started with as we were beginning the organization. Crystal and I, as we were getting ready for this presentation, realized that there are also some foundational pillars of ethical guidelines and boundaries that we wanted to make sure we were touching base with you on. So I'm going to pass the baton to Crystal now for her to share a little bit about those.
Thanks, Meredith. And yeah, as Meredith said, I work as the program director at Wonders and Worries, and then I'm also a licensed professional counselor and registered play therapist at Austin Stone Counseling Center. And so I'm a contract therapist there, but it is a group practice too. And so I may bring in stories from both entities, and recognizing that our audience is broad. We have child life specialists and we have mental health professionals from lots of different disciplines. And we have those that work in hospital settings and those that work in other types of settings. And so we hope that there will be things that touch on whatever you're needing with regards to ethics and boundaries, no matter where you're working. But we felt like it was really important that we look at kind of what are the foundations, what is ethical decision making, what are we talking about, because we can get kind of lost in all of those different words. But ethical decision making, a model is really a way of thinking. It's a way of processing information that we're gathering from a client, from a family, taking what we know from our education, from our background and experience, and really advocating for what is best, what is the best good for this client, and striving for that with them. And there's different principles that we put into play that help us with that. But as somebody I can remember early on in my career, and I think it was actually a presentation that Meredith shared with me that framed it up really well, was ethics are not just trying not to get sued. It's not just trying to stay out of trouble. It's really advocating for what's best for a client, and that was a helpful reframe. And from those of you all that are working in hospital settings, you probably hear the language of culture of trust or near misses, things like that in nursing culture. And a near miss is when they might give a wrong medication or a different dose of medication than they should. From us and a helping professional that's not physical help, but it's emotional help, that near miss would be maybe applying something, an intervention, suggesting something that isn't the best, it's not the ideal for that particular client. And so how do we figure that out? It's very complicated in knowing how to do that. And so, but that really is what ethical decision making is, not just trying not to get sued, although we'd love to do that too. But it's what is best for this client that's in front of us. So, move forward, I'll see little arrows. My arrows went away.
Can you just gonna click on your mouse?
I'm sure I am.
There
Okay.
you go.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I can't multitask in any form. So these are some foundational principles. As Meredith talked about, we touched on this a little bit when we first started shifting gears and started doing these WonderChats, talking about shifting from direct care to virtual support and really evaluating, is this what's best for the kids that we're serving? And regardless of what your discipline is, if you're an LPC, LMFT, social worker, child life specialist, most likely these are the foundational principles of your helping profession. It's not exhaustive, right? Like there's other things that we take into account when we're making decisions for and with a client. But these are likely kind of the most basic guardrails when we're making these decisions. And so autonomy is respect for independence and self-determination. So allowing a child, a family, to make decisions for themselves, to give choice where there's opportunities for that. Justice, it's not about fairness. Justice and fairness are not the same thing. Justice is really giving a client what they need. And so you may be treating different clients somewhat differently based on what they present with. And so, for example, a client who is blind, you may present information to them in Braille because that's what they need, but you aren't going to give every client information in Braille because that's not what they need. And so it's adapting things and making decisions based on what that client needs from you. Beneficence is advocating for the best good, like what is good for this client. We're all individuals, and so again, that's really tricky to determine. And everybody defines good somewhat differently. And so we have to communicate what we see as good and give choices where a client may choose that that's not what fits for them. Non-maleficence is to do no harm. Most of us, we didn't get into a helping profession to hurt people, right? Like we want to do what's good for them. And so, but sometimes we don't see all the layers and all the things that help us know very clearly what that is to do. And then fidelity is loyalty, honoring commitments, keeping your promises. And so when we were shifting from direct support to virtual support, this was one of the big key players here. Was we didn't want to abandon our clients. We had already started relationships with our clients, with our community, and we couldn't just say, hey, we're going to peace out for pandemic, however long that lasts. Like we couldn't do that and continue serving the children and families who have come to depend on knowing that we're going to be there for them. And so that was a big key point in our decision making with COVID. And so with the decision-making model, again, this is a process of making choices, making therapeutic choices with our clients. And so these are, I always like to kind of ask myself internal questions when I'm making decisions that help me know that I'm going in the right course. When it's not a black and white thing, how do I know that this is the right way? And so evaluating what is the issue at hand. So if I get that gut intuitive feeling of like, ooh, I don't know what to do, what is being stirred up there? And then looking at what foundational principles are at play. So taking a peek back at that list of those 5 principles and which of those is potentially at risk of me not being able to follow through with. And then what options are present that do uphold those professional ethics and are supportive for my client. And so a quick example of this for those of y'all that are working in a for-profit setting, maybe a private practice setting, if you have a client that can't afford your fees, how do you handle that? And so the issues that come up are justice, right? Like I want clients to have accessibility to services. And so I want that for those with high income and low income. And we recognize that child life support, counseling support is not just for the rich. And so we need to have accessibility. And yet, how do we do that? Non-maleficence, we don't want harm to come to a client because we aren't able to support them and serve them. And fidelity, especially if we've already established a relationship with a client, we don't want to abandon them because dad is now all of a sudden unemployed. And so those are the key kind of principles at play with this particular scenario. And I've listed 2 options here. There's probably a million, but option 1 might be that if it's a new client coming to you, you're starting your practice, you have to pay your bills. It's okay for you to refer out to another practice that offers sliding scale if that's not something that you can do. If you're offering a few different options, that's completely within your realm to be able to do that. And that doesn't put you at risk for abandoning a client. They aren't yours yet. And you can get them to the support that they need. Or for an existing client, you may offer a sliding scale for a set number of sessions. And so maybe you're like, I can't offer sliding scale for the end of time, but I can for 5 sessions. And so that potential little dip for a few weeks might be just what the clients need to be able to regroup depending on what their financial situation is. And there's like I said, there's a million different other options within that, but those are a couple that might give you some ideas to play with. A fun quote, Aristotle, he's a smart guy. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And what I love about this quote is it really validates that ethical decision making requires both our head and our heart. It requires wisdom and compassion. Those 2 things are not at odds with each other. You know, we have a brain and a heart for a reason. We're designed that way. And so those 2 things can coexist and can really help guide us to supportive practices with our clients. So as Meredith was saying, part of my job as a program director is helping new child life specialists that are coming into our organization get acclimated, make sure they have the systems and the tools that they need to do their job well. We never hire anybody that we ever question their clinical skills. Like everybody that comes to us, they're pretty amazing. And so I don't need to teach them how to do medical play, and I don't need to teach them how to talk to a kid about cancer or how to approach a child or how to approach a family member. They know how to do that. They've been doing that for quite some time and are pretty awesome at it by the time they get to us. But there are things that we do need to orient them to with our systems that it is different. And most of our child life specialists that come to us are either leaving a hospital setting or coming to us maybe after they've stayed home with kids for a little bit and they're re-entering the profession again after a few years once kids go back to school. But most have come from a traditional setting of working in the hospital, and with working in that setting, it's a big system. With any kind of system that's large, there's lots of rules, and some people hate rules. If you're a younger child, I don't like those rules, but it provides containment and it provides that sense of knowing what to do. And that is provided for you externally. If you're my boss, you tell me what to do, cool, I'm gonna do that. But in our setting, in community-based work and private practice work, you really have to do that for yourself. You're more independent. In our setting, even when we are providing direct support in the offices, we have 4 different offices in Austin. We have 1 in San Antonio, 1 in Houston. Those areas are going to grow soon, I'm sure. And so each of our child life specialists operate pretty independently. And so they need to know how to develop that internal gut of, I know how to make decisions even without my boss looking over my shoulder and telling me what to do, or without a big system telling me verbatim what the roadmap is. And so those foundational principles that we talked about at the beginning are still there, right? Like they're still there as our guardrails. But some things in community practice and in private practice, I think, make us more vulnerable or more anxious around decision making. Specifically for us at Wonders and Worries, some of our logistics, the location of our services. We may be doing intakes and sessions, usually intakes and parent consultations only, but within the home. And certainly we're not doing that right now with COVID, but historically we have. And we may see clients for a very long time, for years and years. And then we also are kind of the sole provider. While they have a hospital team that's working with them at the hospital, in our little organization, we're kind of it. And so with that, it can increase a clinician's sense of isolation, a sense of vulnerability. It's more intimate with the clients. I can remember my first intake at Wonders and Worries was in a home, and Dad was dying, and I show up, and he's in a recliner in his pajamas, and he falls asleep in our intake, and so I'm whispering with Mom on the couch while she's making tea and doing laundry, and it was just very different. It was a different way of entering into their story. And certainly with virtual services right now, how many of you are doing sessions and the children are in their bedrooms, and you're like seeing or hearing the fight that's happening in the kitchen while you're trying to do therapeutic work. You're being brought into the messy middle of lots of different things, and with that, it feels different. It feels closer and sometimes less professional in different ways. The size of our organization, we're smaller. Again, it increases the intimacy, even our language, as we talk about the Wonders and Worries family. Well, when you hear the word family, that means I'm here forever, right? Like, you can go off the rails, you can be ridiculous, I'm still gonna be here. And with a family, like, that is tricky. And so when Meredith talks about the business ethics of we want to be able to be here forever, and part of that goes into stewardship of money and funds and all of that, so that we can continue to have a presence here in Austin and beyond. And then also we want to be there for that family as long as it fits for the scope of practice that we're serving them. Capacity, we tend to have a lower capacity than what child life specialists in the hospital setting do. And part of that is because we're working a lot with the whole family. And with that, it requires kind of a depth of knowledge and a depth of time with the families that we're serving. That depending on, it's probably most comparable to chronic care in the hospital. You may be doing that there if that's your population, but it's just different. And then our roles, we wear different hats. And so we're going to be, again, kind of operating with that clinician, businesswoman kind of hat is going to flip on and off at different points. And how do we advocate first and foremost for the clients, and then also make good decisions for our organization so we can continue being around. So I'm going to pause there. Meredith, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to any of that so far.
No, I think that you're doing such a great job of highlighting the focus on the individual clients, you know, and that's always the heart, and our biggest goal is to be thinking about the needs of each individual family. And as you alluded, Crystal, there also comes the greater good of how do we also continue as an organization for the good of the whole community to be here for a long time. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But I'm loving the way you're talking about the individual needs of each client family and the differences.
Cool, thanks. So I threw this slide in here primarily, as I said, all the child life specialists that we're working with have incredible clinical skills. And the time that Kim and I, Kim is the other program director, where we spend the majority of our time coaching our team are in these softer skills and in the things that are blurrier, and the things that each of us are going to be strong or weaker in different of these different areas. But these are the things that when we're looking at a clinician that's moving from a hospital-based setting, big system, to a community-based setting or private practice, smaller system with less guardrails, these are some different skills that are really valuable, and that if you aren't strong in these areas, there's going to be some pieces that are going to be harder for you in the clinical care that you do. Not impossible, but just harder. And so independence, like I said, we tend to be a little bit more isolated. We don't have a boss looking over our shoulder. For those of y'all that don't like micromanaging, it's awesome. But it can also create anxiety if you're like, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. And so that can be tricky. Lots of flexibility. With flexibility, there's lack of containment. I think that was my biggest struggle when I first started at Wonders and Worries, was I never knew when I was working, because it was like, ooh, I can work from home and I can chart while I'm doing my laundry. But I have clients that are asking me for a session on Sunday at 5 p.m. and then a session on Friday night at 7 p.m. And do I really want to do that? And am I allowed to say no? And yes, maybe, but maybe not. I don't know. And so the flexibility is beautiful, but it's also tricky to contain that. And I see that in private practice setting too. If you want to build your client base, you want to be accessible to clients because you need to make a living. But it's also like, how far do I extend myself before I'm not able to be a human in addition to a professional, which we all need to be human. So limit setting. You need to know when to set limits and when to set limits for your client because it's good for them, and also when to set limits for yourself because for you to keep going, you need some boundaries too. Ambiguity tolerance of, I don't know how many times Kim and I were confronted with a question and we're like, I don't know, maybe this, maybe that, right? And I'm sure you've done this with your clients even when they're asking you for a hard fast, like, tell me what to do, which we don't ever do, right? We're like, well, we get to decide, which they hate us for. But it's that we don't know all the information to be able to make that decision. We trust the client to be able to make that decision, but we want to help provide the support to come alongside them to be able to do that. Similarly for our staff, you can make choices. You have the freedom to make choices, and we're going to be here for you, and we're going to help ask these questions, provide the support, but we aren't going to make the decision for you. Proactive nature, being a go-getter, having courage, which courage, of course, always requires vulnerability, right? Like courage, I always think of courageous people as like the warriors that are like out there just doing incredibly brave things, but oftentimes it's the warriors that are really tired that are like trudging along and like army crawling, right? And sometimes that's what we feel like, as opposed to like a sword or whatever. Creativity. We have to be creative as child life specialists. Working with kids in and of itself requires that, but we have to have creativity and flexibility of mind as well, of recognizing that some days I'm going to be doing purely clinical care, some days I'm going to be doing outreach, some days I'm going to be talking to donors and thanking them for the donations that make the clinical care possible. Sometimes I'm going to be doing presentations like this, and so you have to have creativity even with just the things that you're doing. Strong work ethic and communication skills, and communication skills are key. So these are some common ethical dilemmas that you see in child life practice universally. Just recognizing the type of relationship. Are we friends or are we professionals? And I think any of us would say, well, Crystal, of course we're professionals. But there's a couple things specifically with child life practice that make this hard to define. Specifically, we work with kids. So kids, while we know it's a professional relationship, kids don't. Like the way that I engage with them often feels like a play date. I give them a snack, I validate their feelings, I sit on the floor, I'm playing with them. That feels like a play date, so I'm just a really old friend. But it also, I think, specifically in non-profits, we aren't accepting a fee. And so that can also create that sense of it's not professional. It's not a fee for service. So then it feels closer. It feels more like your best friend giving you guidance as opposed to a professional. And so that's, I think, a tricky little hiccup that creates more of a sense of us communicating clearly from the beginning of the relationship of what ways are okay for us to engage, what ways aren't, why. It's not because I don't care for you, it's because of this. I had a kiddo that I worked with in the hospital setting who, when I was transitioning jobs, I was moving from one medical population to another, and I was preparing him for that. I was working in renal and was switching to a position in radiology. And so I was preparing him for that about a month out so that he had time to prepare. And he started crying. He was like, "You don't like toys anymore?" And it was heartbreaking. And I'm like, "Of course I love toys, and of course I love you. Like, I love our time together." But I had to switch positions, and I had to prepare him for meeting his new child life specialist, who he was angry at, not because she wasn't awesome, but because it wasn't my face bringing him toys. And so we had to create this like meeting off period of, I would come twice a week to see him just to say, hey, even though I was working in a new area. And Ashley, who was awesome, saw him daily so that he got used to her face. And we were able to work out how he could transition. But he saw me as a friend. He saw me as a friend, and he did not understand why all of a sudden it kind of felt like a breakup or something. But it wasn't. It was a decision I had to make. So. Scope of practice. So what is your role? Again, therapeutic play or play therapy, which that is always tricky because if you're a child life specialist that has amazing reflective skills, you are going to sound a lot like Gary Landreth, who is the guru, right? And yet that's not your role. And so you have to have good intuitive knowledge of, this is my role, this is my boundary, this is when I refer to our awesome play therapists in the community, and this is what I can do to serve children impacted by illness. And so it's kind of fluid, but you intuitively just need to know when it's time to ask for help. Competence, it's similar, right? It's like you need to know and know well what you do know. It's also important to know what you don't know, and to be able to consult, just like Meredith talked about at the beginning, with people who know more than you, have more experience than you, and can talk things through with you. When I first started working at the counseling practice where I work, I've worked with kids for 18 years now. And so I wasn't intimidated by being a play therapist, but I was intimidated by working in a church setting and offering biblically based care. That was different. And then I was working with a lot of kids who had attachment issues. A lot of our church families that come to us have adopted, and that was a new area. And so I, being the anxious perfectionist that I am, took a lot of classes, a lot of them, probably too many, read a lot of books, again, probably too many, but that was my way of making sure that I was going to be able to offer the best good that I could to the families that I was serving. So, and then our mission, certainly we are making decisions organizationally that really strive at who are we here to serve, and that's not a wanting to withhold from anybody that's not within our scope, but it's really wanting to serve well the families that are, and wanting to provide clarity to the community as a whole of who we are organizationally. And so that some of those decisions I know early on, and Meredith can speak to this, we offered support to siblings and grandparent illnesses, and we've had to kind of back away from that some in these latter years, primarily because we're inundated with children who have a parent with an illness, and that's our primary focus. And so it's not a desire to withhold care from kids who have a sibling with an illness, but it's an acknowledgement that there's child life specialists in the hospital setting that can provide that better than we can, because they have close proximity to the physicians that are caring for that child. They know what's going on the day-to-day, and they have the ability to support them more robustly. So, Meredith, do you have some things that you'd like to add to this one?
I can, just as a little bit of a case story, because for us at Wonders and Worries, the initial guidelines we received when filing for our 501c3 was to make our mission statement as broad as we foresaw needing it in the future. So definitely by definition, we had the space to work with children who had a sibling who had an illness themselves and needed sibling support, as this example. And in the beginning, we took some of those client families for various reasons. Maybe they weren't being served at Children's Hospital, or they were being served from out of state. Different things happened. And just to give you an example of how we worked through this issue, because as Crystal said, we all have a giving heart, and we would love to meet the needs of everyone who needed us, but we had a defined amount of resources. And it became apparent within the organization, largely from feedback of our child life specialists and then through our program directors, that we were out of bandwidth. And at the same time, as we were getting sort of this qualitative awareness and assessment, we had hired our independent evaluator, who was doing a very thorough evaluation of our program services. And that evaluator came back to us and said, you have two distinct populations. The people who have an adult family member in the home with a serious illness, a parent, and the people that have a child in the home with siblings that need support, those are two different groups. And when we were armed with that information, then we went to our board. And again, stepping through, what do we do? And yes, we made the hard decision to narrow our scope of practice to children who have a parent with a serious illness, but we had client families that were being served who fit in this other area. So, the process that we went through of writing a policy for new intakes, communicating to the families that were being served already of the change, assuring them that they would continue to be cared for, and allowing them to express their thoughts, feelings. And I'll say while all of them regretted the decision, they understood it. And just as sort of a little side note, we do some social activities with our families. And this one family who had 4 little girls, when the 5th little girl was born and died in the NICU, and there was no support for that family, they continued to come to our family fun events for 10 years. So we kept them for a long time. But the point is, we created a policy change, and we tried in the best scope of practice what was to communicate and move through that shift in an ethical manner. And then the only other thing I would say is grandparents are listed on the slide. That's a challenge too, and requires our best assessment skills as child life specialists, because again, our policy is that if there are parents who are well and healthy and able to take our information with a parent consult and then help translate that and guide the support of their family when it is a grandparent with an illness, that's where we go, again, to preserve our resources. But there are many times where the grandparent is the primary caregiver. And so that may sound like grandparent, but really translates in our vernacular as parent. They are the parent for that child. So again, just a little add-ons.
Can I just jump in real quick for a second? We have a question, and Crystal, you touched on this a little bit, but I think it's relevant on this slide. But the question is, and I think sometimes I just love hearing your language that you use, both of you. So, but the question is, when you realize the relationship is changing from professional to friend, how do you redirect without hurting the relationship? Any tips on that or thoughts on that?
Communicate. Yeah, I think sometimes I'm an over communicator just in general. But yeah, I think it's really essential to explain the why or even to acknowledge the feelings. Sometimes the client may not even be aware of what's happening, but just being like, you know what, I find myself like treating you more like a friend than I do somebody that I'm working with, and that's interesting. And I'm wondering if you feel that way too. And I just want to make sure that we're clear of these are the things I can offer, these are the things that I can't. And make sure that you understand why that is. And I can think of one of our staff members who had a family who she had worked with for a very long time. And as Meredith said, we do work with a lot of families for years. And part of that is because illnesses are long, can be. And also when we work with a child at different developmental stages, they oftentimes need different things. So if we're going through our illness education curriculum with a child at 4, and they may need it again at 6, they may need it again at 12. And so we're working with kids that are growing and changing and needing reminders of what they learned before about illness. And illnesses look different at different ages. It affects kids differently at different ages. And so there is legitimate reason why we may be seeing a family for a very long time. And it's not just us wanting to keep them because they're awesome. We want to keep them because we're serving them, and we care for them in that way. But I had one staff member who once brought to me a situation, and she was really flustered, and she brings this gift bag to me, and she's like, my client family just brought me this, and it wasn't that they had brought her a gift, right? Because all of us have probably been brought a gift, and we have rules like if it's less than this amount of money, then you're good. And it wasn't expensive, but it was the emotional nature of what the gift was. And it was this very personal picture of this family on vacation. And it was a spot that it was Hawaii, which is a really important place for the family, but also for the child life specialist, for different things happening in her world. And she was like, I think I made a mistake. I think I made a mistake. Like they asked questions, and I shared a little bit more about my life, and now they're bringing me pictures from Hawaii, and I just don't know what to do with this. And so just being able to say like, okay, like they were like, you have cared for them for a very long time, and they are bringing something back to you to care for you. Like that doesn't mean that your relationship is changing. Like you're still serving them in the way that you always have. And you can just share like, man, this is really special and this is really personal. And I don't think they're doing that as a manipulation strategy for you to give them more. Like, and so we just kind of evaluated all the different things and how she needed to communicate with the family, if she did. Yeah, just tried to look at it from all the lenses. So I feel like I'm talking in like circles, but I think essential was that child life specialist felt uncomfortable. And so she brought it to somebody that could help walk her through like the different areas. We looked at the different principles and then evaluated what does her course of action need to be? Does it need to be different than what it is now to maintain the professionalism of that relationship? I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah. Missy, if I can interject for just a minute too. I heard that question as professional turning to friend within the therapeutic relationship of the counseling that's going on, the therapeutic relationship. And I'll be talking a lot more about that dilemma in the roles of client families being able to give back to the organization. So more is to come very shortly around that. And again, that may have been more focused around here, which is totally appropriate, the therapeutic relationship, but it also enters into just the organization as a whole and what's needed by the organization to move forward in the community. And I'll say, I'll repeat it, I hope, again, but I think at Wonders and Worries, we have found that the opportunity for a client family to give back is also healing and therapeutic for them. So I'll come back to that.
Yeah, that'll be good. Sorry, my arrows went away again. I feel like PowerPoint is like trying to like be sneaky.
Just click your mouse maybe.
Thank you. Thank you, Missy. Okay. A couple other things that come up a lot in child life practice, complex needs, right? Like we have our own scope of practice. We have a mission that we are here to serve children of adult patients. And the reality is that kids come to us, families come to us with other stuff too. And so they come to us with parents that are divorcing, they come to us with trauma in their background, they come to us with anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation. And that doesn't necessarily mean 100% of the time that we can't serve them. Even though our scope of care is preventative level of care, when an illness is occurring, there's room for us to play and support, but we need to make sure that we are addressing the primary need. And that's one of the key assessment pieces that you need to determine if it's really you that takes the first phase of support, or if it's a mental health professional. And so that's one of the key things that we look at when a child is presenting with multiple things is, what has the history of support been? Do they have a current therapist? Is it better to maintain that relationship with that therapist and we just provide education and support to the therapist? Or is it that that therapist isn't comfortable with medical, so we do medical, they do the other stuff? Has the family never sought support? And so we really need them to be assessed, especially if it's more crisis oriented, because we aren't a crisis center. And so all of those things play into the decision of, am I going to care for this family? Am I going to receive them as a client and start this work with them? Or is there somebody else that needs to start that work first? And then we can supplement with what they need for the medical piece. And so that's something that's really important, especially for those of y'all that are thinking about going into private practice or starting a community-based setting, is just recognizing it's messy and families come messy. And so you serve them as best you can with what you have, and then you get good at asking for help from people that know other things more than you. And so build good relationships with other professionals in your community so that you can serve the whole child, the whole family, but it may not be you taking point on all the things. So, and then termination, which I hate that word, but closure. When do you end? And again, working with kids, you may not for a very long time, and that's okay. It's just really being able to have a rationale for why you're serving them and what the developmental need is, what is the need based on the illness, what is the need based on what they present with, and how you're going to serve them. And when are those key indicators that either care is done because they've reached their goals, or care is done because they have different needs that require a different level of support. And so those are the key things that you want to look at with that. So, oops. There we go. I'm going to pass the baton to Meredith for more information on that big picture. She's so good at sharing.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Crystal. And that's a perfect segue. Just touching base on that termination, to terminate or not to terminate. In our clinical practice, and our community-based clinical practice, lots of times clients, we need them to stay involved and connected with the organization. Going back to where Missy and I were with that passion, they're the ones that likely are as passionate about the organization as we are, and we do have needs. So sometimes termination doesn't look exactly like termination, but a transition, and how do you go about doing that? But let's focus right now on what are some of those needs that a community-based child life practice has. And the first one is stories. Thinking back, I think this is clearly where I struggled the most. And again, Crystal did such a great job of, I think, focusing on our desire to maintain client confidentiality, to respect the client, to ensure that we are being as mindful as possible around what their privacy, their needs are. And yet, I became aware as we grew as an organization that the data, the numbers were of course important, and people in the community wanted to know how many clients we had served. They wanted to know what the percentage of growth was from one year to the next, how much it cost to provide support services for one family. But below all of that data, the numbers, there were stories. There was that heart. that was equally important for people in the community to understand why our support was needed, what kind of benefit it gave to the family, and how and when do you take those, seek stories. I'm not even seek them, ask permission, or plant the seed that a story would be beneficial. And again, as I said, the stories were something and are something that our client families can give as a priceless gift. It is something any family can choose to do if they're comfortable with it. But what does that process look like to begin that? That was one dilemma that, again, seems to just stand out and resonate for me as the beginnings. But another need that we had was skill sets. As I said, we were did not have expertise in marketing, website design, finances, and we needed volunteers. We had limited resources, and volunteers were a wonderful way that could lend a skill to us, even all the way, most importantly, to serving on our board for a longer tenure of time and lending their expertise as a lawyer for us, or as our accountant, whatever. So we needed those skill sets and sought those from the people who, again, identified with us and our mission. And many times it was people in the community who had had an ill parent and were now adults and wished that they had services like ours when they were young. But there's also the understanding and belief that it's important to engage on your board people who have received services, who are part of your communities, and from that perspective. So how and when does that occur? And then, importantly, as I said, because we chose to have our services without charge to our family and have all of these needs to be met, how do we provide the staff salaries for our child life specialists? When are we ever able to actually hire a professional who can do some public relations work for us? And how do we go about even fundraising to present a gala? And it's important, again, to have somebody speaking at that event who can reflect what the organization has done for them. And so all of these things were needs of the organization, and we were constantly kind of weighing, how do we create best practices for our client families in the midst of the needs of this community practice? So Crystal, if you'll just move on to the next one, please. I felt like myself, especially as the executive director, sort of saw that bigger picture, and at times definitely felt like I was wearing more than one hat, trying to balance the overall good for the organization with the very important needs and best practices for our client families. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But right now, I thought I would focus a little bit on those client transitions, because as Crystal said, in a therapeutic world, things may transition. And to answer the question that was asked, I also agree that speaking clearly around that transition is very important. And for me, I guess I love to say that having been around a long time and being older, I have been able to see families that we worked with go through, and the children move from being served to giving back with the organization and being adults. One of our very first clients that was in our pilot program, Missy worked with on an individual basis afterwards. You know, she clearly transitioned. There was an ending. Her father died when she was in middle school. She stopped receiving support services from us. But the engagement has been very much a back and forth over the years. When she was in high school, she was asked to write a term paper about an organization that she felt was very pivotal in the community. And she came back to Wonders and Worries and interviewed me And there was the stipulation in this term paper that she do volunteer work for the organization. And she chose, as part of her volunteer work, to speak at a fundraising event for us. So again, that relationship was shifting from client serve to giving back. She continued on staying in connection with us. After college, she actually served on our finance board. So seeing that client transition and how to process that on multiple levels as clients move forward to different ages, different phases of life, is definitely one of the areas that's been both rewarding but also challenging on how to navigate it. Speaking of dual relationships, again, just wanting to explain how this is, as Crystal said, a little bit more present, maybe, for us in a community setting. But specifically for me, again, in my neighborhood, people know who I am, know what I do, and often attend our fundraising events. And about 4 years ago now, one of my neighbors, across the street neighbor actually, had been supportive of the organization, attended events, and then her husband was diagnosed with colorectal cancer when she had a 1, 4, and 6-year-old. All of a sudden, she became a Wonders and Worries client. And for me, it was challenging. Certainly, I was not her child life specialist, but I had a neighborhood of people who were having conversations with me about her. I had her right across the street. I wanted to be a good neighbor to her, but I also had my professional responsibilities to be confidential. And it was just a tricky situation to assure her that what I knew about her situation through Wonders and Worries would not be shared with any neighbors, and how to balance conversations with neighbors in a way that reflected my appreciation for their concern without giving information to them, and sometimes needing to be very direct around it. So again, those dual relationships come into play, I think, maybe a little bit more predominantly in our community setting than they might in a more traditional setting. So Crystal, if you'll go to the next slide. I wanted to focus primarily on one of the most challenging, I think, dilemmas, which is, as Crystal was saying, the child life specialist. Clearly, we became aware that the child life specialist is really the gatekeeper for our client families. As imposing needs come in from the organization, it is the child life specialist that knows of the client families that might potentially be able to meet that need. We might have a communications person or a development director say, we would really like a family with this profile that we can highlight. Maybe it's around breast cancer awareness. We actually participated in a run that benefits our organization for our client families we serve with breast cancer. So under that umbrella, sometimes we need to identify a client family that has breast cancer. Who is most likely to know of a family and have a sense of, is it a right time to ask? And I think especially in a nonprofit setting where there is no fee for services, and we'll get to this in a minute too, around helping the families become aware of how the funding does occur, but we don't want to ever put undue expectation on a client family that we need you to do this, or it's conditional of receiving our services. So being very sensitive to have they perhaps had made some references. I sure wish there's something I could do to help you. And a piece of that for us has been building in information and training to our child life specialists to help them get to a comfort level to hear those potential comments and know how they can potentially respond. And to the point of, at some points, we actually had where families would come and go with their children. a little sheet that could be grabbed. And if you wanted to give a statement or tell a story, here, just fill this out. We tried to, again, build in those processes. But most importantly, that child life specialist, we became aware, is that gatekeeper. And we wanted to give them the opportunity to think about how they could offer the choice to a client family in an ethical way to make them aware of it. Another, I think, important component of it is we became aware through some funding that came to us from the community. I think this is our primary way we became aware of this, that those funds were in a restricted account to meet the needs of families that were beyond therapeutic support. It might be for food, or to pay an electric bill, or transportation costs to get to a medical appointment. As our child life team working in our community setting sometimes encountered these dire needs of families, we did have some funding that would allow us to address those. Early on, we realized that while it was the child life specialist who was most aware of what those needs of that family were, once that relationship went down that path and the family became aware of the opportunity to potentially get additional support through our organization, not all, but some families, it felt like to the child life specialist like that therapeutic relationship was not as authentic. It felt uncomfortable. And as an organization, again, wanting to make the best choices, whether we could afford it or not, we tried to pull that child life specialist away from that component and allow her to have the therapeutic relationship, and finding distinct people in the organization who were not involved with the therapeutic relationship to administer essentially that process of obtaining those additional funds. Yeah, and I said whether we could afford it or not, because in the beginning, we pulled in some volunteers that were skilled, whether they were social work interns or things like that, to make sure that those needs were met, and again through our COO handling the actual monies involved. We've been able as an organization to grow to have what we call a resource navigator, who is that person one step removed from the child life specialist, who can identify community resources and match them for the client family. Similarly, our development director works hand in hand with our child life specialists and our program directors to not only find potentially people who can tell stories, potentially give their skill sets in terms of being involved in our committees or potentially our board, and also potentially through funding. Some of our families have the means to be able to provide support for our services, and communicating that. We have come to be aware that families want to understand how our services are funded, but how you go about doing that, we've always had different messaging for our client families, regardless of income. If they're a client family, the messaging has been different. And it started on multiple levels, the content, being very mindful that our content would be distinct as opposed for the general community. For example, and I think all three of these things, the frequency, the content, and the timing, all play into our annual fund. Every year at the end of the year, starting in November, we are sending out a request for end of the year giving. The initial ask for a client family, this might be the only request that they have gotten up until recently for funding, and it doesn't look the same because we are asking them to give back financially, but we're asking them to potentially share with people they know, whether it's family members or friends or people they do business with, sharing with them who and what we are, and if they have the opportunity to support us, then we would appreciate that. So again, the frequency of our communications around our funding is different to our client families, the content, and then the timing. And I think that the best example of this is the most recent process that we've gone through with our program directors and our development director, and then ultimately shared with our full programming team for their feedback and then also for their knowledge. But our client families receive an email explaining some of the funding of our organization, but it's, I want to say, 3 to 6 months after they've become a client. So it's a much longer time before we even begin just letting them be aware of how we're funded, and then moving them through that process with the opportunity down the road for them to become what we call a partner in hope, which is a giving campaign that is for families who have received services. And you can see on our website around that. But I just know from my personal experiences, sharing with client families at the right time how our services are funded is actually very validating. And many of them wonder, but haven't known exactly how we get the funds to be able to do what we do, and are usually very grateful to be able to know what that process is like. So Chris, I'll let you go on to the next slide. But how do we do this? We do have a process in place, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what our organizational process for thinking through some of these ethical situations where we feel like we want to meet the needs of the individual client families, but also be cognizant of the needs of the organization. And this sort of circular diagram didn't necessarily look like this when we were first putting this presentation dialogue together. And I feel very gratified, and Missy, I hope you do too, that Crystal said, oh, I think you need to put culture of trust at the beginning, because that should be at the top, because that really has permeated the organization from its inception. So I'm honored about that. It really truly is, though, a process that's very fluid. Yes, we have our standard operating guidelines that have evolved over the years. We also overlay those, of course, with our business guidelines. And I think that last example I just gave you showed how our business guidelines, perhaps around asking client families to help support our funding, fits with our standard operating guidelines. But when we have those parameters, those guardrails in place around policies, we are having dialogue through supervision in each of those ways I described, whether it's at our program staff meeting or one-on-one with a child life specialist and the program director, or even at our big full staff meeting. There is conversation going on about how things may be perceived by client families, how things are working. Is something feeling out of step? Do we need to adjust something? For a variety of reasons, our growth, the changing times, the pandemic, there can be lots of reasons why we might feel like, we maybe need to look at this again. Sometimes we need to pull in outside experts, that consultation piece. But it's a very fluid process of feeling comfortable to share, hey, something doesn't feel right to me. Let's look at it as a group, as an organization. Consider, do we need to shift our policies a little bit? And I'm going to give you a current example, which is still very much in process, but not too long ago, really shortly before Christmas, one of our registered Wonders and Worries providers actually came to Missy and said, hey, I see on your website that you have the phrase, and it's something like, we teach parents to parent. And I know where that phrase came from. It came from a wonderful communications person we had, and she was in the business of helping us resonate and sound good to the community. And it's catchy. We teach parents how to parent. Yes, I get that. But what she came back, and again, maybe that's that culture of trust. I'm glad that she felt comfortable to go to Missy and say, you know, where I'm coming from, I'm really working with parents, trying to help them feel affirmed in their parenting skills when they come to us, and helping enhance their parenting skills. And Missy came back to us and said, you know, she's got a very valid point. I'm not sure that the underlying message in that phrase is what we want as an organization. And so again, our kind of program leaders, we reflected on it and we're like, you know, you're right. I think we need to shift that. And it permeates down through the organization, even in shifting the wording of what we're saying in our grants. So again, the ethical dilemma, I think, came in from a layperson, excellent in her job around marketing, putting a phrase out there that as an organization, clinically speaking, we don't really want that second sub-message. What it's really saying about us to be exactly as it's interpreted. So shifting it. And we're not there yet. We kind of took a deeper dive in our whole website, and there's still some phrases we're going to relook at, but it's that dynamic process of constantly assessing, looking, trusting other people within the organization and outside the organization to have that lens to say, are we doing best practices in this moment in time? So anyway, I think at this point, Missy, Crystal, if you'll shift to the next slide, I'm going to turn it back over to you to shift back into sort of that individual child life specialist and thinking about what questions would be most beneficial for them in their clinical responsibility assessment.
Yeah, no, for sure. I loved that little circle diagram. It was really validating for me too, of just recognizing I've been a part of a lot of different teams, and I'm a part of 2 teams now who that culture of trust exists robustly. And I'm just so thankful of just the freedom that I feel like I have with each of our team members on our leadership team and our clinical team to have all the conversations, whatever the conversations need to be. And I think especially with our cultural climate and a lot of things that are going on in the world, we need safe spaces to be able to process things. And I'm just so thankful to be where I am. So so these are, again, some just different questions that you can ask yourself when you are making decisions alongside your clients of what is best, that sometimes help clarify if you're deviating from what's best. My favorite one is, have I consulted with a colleague? If not, why? Usually, if I'm being sneaky, there's something that I'm like trying to cover up, or there's something that is more the priority than the ethic. If I can't share fully with either my supervisor or my teammate or whatever, there's usually something wrong. And so that question is a really good gut check for me. But also being able to look at, again, what does the client need? Is that need, are there personal needs that are coming up for me that are maybe making things blurry, that are making it hard to see the client need through that? Is there risk with this decision? What's at risk? What good can come from this decision? Is my anxiety really about me trying to be brave? And I do know what to do, but I'm scared to do it. And so I need that courage to move forward, because this really is what's best for the client. And then would I advocate for this for another client in a similar circumstance? So am I being equitable where there is need? And so again, those kind of questions can just help you really gauge what are the principles at play here. What is coming up for me? Is this a personal thing? Is this something for the client? And then how do I move forward? We're going to share a couple stories. I'm going to share mine really quickly. Mine is pretty quick, and then we'll get to Meredith. But as we were processing through how we wanted to share this, of course, I love stories. I feel like it makes it more practical and applicable. But I had a recent client family that I was working with at Wonders and Worries who I just really struggled with. I struggled to feel like I did the best work that I could have, even though I didn't know what else I could have done. And but I specifically was working with a family who I had worked previously with the kids in a group when they had first joined our organization a few years ago, and Dad was first diagnosed. And then they came back to us when Dad was put on hospice care and he was dying this summer. And I worked with the 3 kiddos individually. They were all at different ages. There's a 16-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 12-year-old. And had worked with them through our curriculum, but was providing continued support because things with Dad were getting worse. And so just kind of helping prepare for what those last days and last moments with him would be, and helping them deal with the messy emotions related to that. And my very last session with the kids, specifically the oldest daughter, she shared something, and she shared it kind of, she just breezed right past it, but talked about these very adult responsibilities that she was having to do. And she was doing them willingly, but she was being asked to do a lot of things that were really hard. And specifically, Dad was sick, Mom had just had a surgery, and Grandma was there to help, but Grandma was Grandma. And so a situation had happened where Dad had fallen in the shower, and the 16-year-old little girl is having to help the grandma lift her dad in the shower. And it was just this very, again, she breezed right past it, where I was like, whoa, 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 like let's come back to that and let's process through. That was hard. Like that was not something you were prepared for. And that was likely something you didn't think that you would ever have to do or see, or all of that. And so we got to touch on it a little bit. And then we transitioned into, I was scheduling them for the next session, and that happened to be on the day that Dad died. And so I'm texting with Aunt, who's saying they can't meet with you today. And I'm like, of course, I'll reach out in a week and just touch base and see, but I'm here if you need anything. And a week goes by and I haven't heard from them. And so I reach out and I say, hey, like I'm just checking in, wondering how you all are doing. I'm sure y'all are planning a funeral or just had a funeral. And I know that that's really heavy and hard, but continue to be here, and would love to schedule the kids again. And I don't hear anything. And so I give 2 weeks that go by and I reach out again, and I don't hear anything. And so for me, I'm like, no, like we have so much more we need to process. We have so much more that we need to do. I hate goodbyes. That was messy and we didn't get to fully process everything. And yet I had to trust, like I couldn't keep hounding the family. That would not be therapeutic. That would be meeting my need more than theirs. And I had done my due diligence that I would do with any family that I was trying to close out with. But at some point I had to let go of my need to have closure with that teenage girl and trust that they have my phone number and they know how to get in touch with me when they do. And they have, historically they have, when things got bad with Dad, when his relapse happened. And so anyways, but that was really hard. It brought up a lot for me. It was difficult to be able to just let go and to trust that the work was sufficient. So I'll stay there and then pass to Meredith, who has another story. We're ending on hers because hers is happier. So
we are going to end on mine, and I'm looking at the time also. So I'm going to tell my story that's positive. I think it borders on the latter part of our presentation, which is on self-care. So Missy, I'll let you interject time-wise if there's questions or something that we want to wrap up a little bit more sooner than finishing up on the self-care. But essentially, mine is, again, when I was executive director, but also seeing client families, and I got a call from a grandfather, very concerned grandfather, who had chosen to finally intercede above his son and daughter-in-law's wishes because he had a 3-year-old grandson, barely 3, and he was deeply concerned at what he was seeing in his 3-year-old grandson. The mom, his daughter-in-law, was essentially just weeks away, we didn't necessarily know that at the time, from dying of breast cancer. And he felt like finally his responsibilities as grandfather superseded anything else, and he reached out to Wonders and Worries for services. We were able to service the family. It was a very brief time before the mom died. I remember going to the hospital for the intake and then getting a call very shortly after that she had died. It was complex in the situation that there was a whole community of people around this son and little boy. 9 people, 9 extended family members. When you looked at both sets of grandparents on both sides of the family, some that were divorced, so there were step grandparents involved, a sister that was an ER doctor, her 2 little boys that were cousins playing. It was complex. We did a lot of work for a fairly long time. Dad attended a dad's group we had that had in similar situations. Fast forward, not that long, like 2.5 years, this man who was married to his childhood sweetheart married another woman who had never been married. They had a child of their own. I was included in the 5th year remembrance of his wife. They're very much holding the whole family and respecting the mother of this little boy in their family makeup. But the most healing thing for me was to receive the invitation to go to the court proceedings for the adoption of this little boy by the stepmother. And I just remember sitting, actually, the judge invited me and a few other special people to sit in the juror's box and looking out at that courtroom, watching the father and stepmother, and the judge questioning them, and the father saying that his wife, mother of his little boy, had entrusted the care of him, and he knew that she would want this woman here on earth to be his mother, taking care of him here. And to me, it was just such a therapeutic healing process to see, because this dad, he had floundered so much after the death of his wife, and to have that structure, that wholeness, and yet the remembrance of the mother brought into this family situation, and for me to be a part of it all those years later was very healing and therapeutic. Which, again, Missy, I know we're kind of running out on. Are we good?
Well, we have about 3 more minutes, and we do need to get to that last slide. So I think.
Okay. And so I think essentially, Crystal, do you want to take this? We're just talking about how you honor the work you've done with children. And for me, sometimes it is in attending events afterwards and being able to see over the course of time the good that we've been able to do.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk while I pull up this last slide, because I know that y'all need this for the eval and the credit or whatever, but I'll just speak to, we had hoped to get to self-care as an ethic and like really looking at, is self-care an ethical issue? And I would argue that it is. And the fact that it's always at the end of our presentations and we never get to it is really comical and awful at the same time. We need to do our own on self-care, but closing out care with clients, regardless of whether it's a grief experience or a death or closure in and of itself, I think is really, really important. And the work that we do takes a toll. It takes a toll on us. And if we don't have, my own therapist at some point had told me, she's like, you know, we have rituals around grief for a reason. Funerals happen for a reason because it helps our head and our heart make sense of things holistically. And if we don't do those rituals, a lot of times we flounder. And specifically for those of us that are working in this kind of work where there's lots of endings, lots of things that end when you don't want them to, in the ways that you don't want them to, even when you're doing the best work that you can. And so I think that's really, really important. Something that I know I don't do very well. And I think collectively as a profession, I don't know that we do very well. And I may go over a little bit for those of y'all that need to hop off, please do. But I want to share a story I learned this from a palliative care doctor that I worked with in Dallas. I was struggling, I was working in oncology and it was just a mess. Like I was a hot mess, really struggling with not taking care of myself, It felt like kids were dying everywhere, and I began to anticipate a child's funeral when I first met them. Like, I can remember going and meeting a child for the first time and being like, in my head internally, I did not say this, but when am I going to go to your funeral? Like, that's what I was thinking, which is not a healthy place to be for myself or for that family. It was really messy. And I can remember just going to this doctor. I didn't even have a close relationship with him. I was like, I just need your help. I know you do this all the time. I need your help. And he was so sweet and took me into his office, and he pointed out this gigantic jar of dum-dums, of the stupid little suckers. and he was like, this is what I do. Like, when I am working at death, when I'm working with a family that has meant a lot to me, and it ends. Most of the time it was ending in death for him, but it could have ended in different ways. He's like, I come back to my office and I pick out a sucker and I sit and I eat the sucker. And while I do, I think about that family. I think about the child. I think about the child's unique personality. I think about their unique laugh. I think about the fun moments that we got to share, the hard moments, the hard questions that they asked me, the moments of courage that they showed. I think about the family. I think about the family and the way that they rallied around each other, the way that they supported each other, the way that they struggled to support each other. And I think about the things I got to do, and I think about the things I didn't get to do, and I eat my sucker. And that is my way of honoring that child and that family. And it's important for me to continue to be able to go to the next family and to honor them and to come to work the next day and not feel completely depleted. And so I loved that story, and I took it to heart of what I don't eat dum-dums. That's not my ritual, but I have a different ritual. But I think the important ethic of that is creating a ritual of honoring the work that you're doing and pausing and celebrating, grieving. Just like our head and our hearts are not on opposing teams, joy and grief are not on opposing teams. And so they can coexist. And so, yeah, I hope you will do that for yourself.
Crystal, thank you so much for that beautiful example too. I was sitting here thinking, gosh, I wish someone would have told me that a long time ago. I love the dum-dum example. And to your point about self-care, I agree. And just so those of us out there know, that is on our list to have its own webinar where we can take a really deeper dive into self-care, and we can move into what Crystal's talking about with the self-care as an ethic. We want it to be a little deeper than just these are the things we do, but sort of why are we doing the things we do? So anyway, it is on our agenda for one of these webinars coming up. We appreciate you all being here. I appreciate Meredith and Crystal so much for sharing their expertise, knowledge about what could be a difficult topic, and really having to dig in and process things and sort of put yourself out there about the things that you are concerned about or what you've done well, or how did you figure things out. So thank you both so much for that. I want to let our listeners know that our February WonderChat is scheduled for the 19th from 12 to 1 Central. The speakers for that will be Jordan Rook, who is our outreach manager at Wonders and Worries, and Shani Thornton, who is a registered Wonders and Worries provider. You also might know her as Child Life Mommy in her private practice. And they will be talking about sort of the general topic. They're still fleshing it out. So, but the general concept themes are going to be surrounding collaboration, outreach, engagement, connecting with other professionals to build your practice, to build a service, to build a program. So look for that. More of their details of their bullets will come out as they flesh that out over the next week or so. So thank you all for being here, and we will look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Bye.